So if it's not fear of terrorism, if it's not ISIS, and if it's not 9/11, what is it? Well, I'm going to argue today that a small network of anti-Muslim organizations in the wake of the September 11th attacks captivated the media, and specifically through emotional appeals. And though these organizations were once peripheral actors within the broader family of organizations trying to shape public discourse about Islam, they've now raised more than $242 million to mount one of the most significant campaigns to shift American public opinion against Islam. I'll show you how they've exerted considerable influence upon our counterterrorism policy, the recent wave of so-called anti-Sharia laws, and perhaps most disturbingly, how they've even been hired to train our counterterrorism officials. And all of this, of course, occurs in the broader context of the so-called battle for hearts and minds that we currently find ourselves in against groups like Daesh or ISIS. And surely, as I'll show you at the end of my talk, these fringe ideas about these anti-Muslim ideas are avid travelers. They get picked up by international media, where I think they may do their most significant harm by tarnishing the reputation of the United States, which was once a paragon for religious freedom, and making it seem as though the U.S. is in fact anti-Muslim, thereby validating the claim of groups like ISIS or Daesh that the U.S. is fundamentally at war with Islam. So this is the subject of my book that Omid, Dr. Safi mentioned, Terrified How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream. Now, historically, social scientists, I'm a cultural sociologist, we've looked at small cases of organizations that exerted profound change on public discourse. So we track down an organization that shapes, we talk about, say, nuclear energy or any kind of big social problem that we all kind of deal with. And there are a variety of problems with that approach. We'd wind up studying groups that succeed, and we wouldn't learn about groups that fail. And we'd wind up with a distorted picture that uses some circular reasoning to try to understand how groups exert influence on public discourse. But when I was trained, I was learning alongside other social scientists about the new wave of computational social science methods, or for so-called big data. These are the increasingly large amounts of data that are available due to the rise of social media, the internet, the mass digitization of archival and historical records, and so on and so forth. And so in my book, I leverage these new computational methods to try to answer this question. Who gets to speak on behalf of Islam before the American public, and why? And to do this, I collected a massive sample of press releases produced by any organizations trying to shape public discourse about Islam. So these include not only anti-Muslim fringe organizations, but also groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations or various other Muslim Public Affairs Council, and so on and so forth, other kind of advocacy groups, religious organizations, think tanks, and so on and so forth, all non-state and non-profit groups trying to shape public discourse about Islam. I then collected all mentions of these organizations in a large group of media documents. So these include newspapers such as the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Times, designed intentionally to measure the kind of political spectrum of the media from left to right, as well as TV, Fox News, CNN, and CBS News. And the innovation of my work is to use a plagiarism detection algorithm to track the extent to which each press release exerts influence upon these larger documents, this larger public discourse about Islam. And what's neat about these new algorithms is we can not only identify kind of verbatim quotes. So here we have a press release that says bias and hate are un-American. This algorithm will also identify near matches or paraphrased quotes of the press releases. Bias and tolerance are un-American in this case. And they enable a kind of quantitative measure of the amount of influence of each organization upon public discourse about Islam. I also conducted in-depth interviews with the leaders of of all of these organizations, or a subsample of these organizations, both those that succeeded in influencing public discourse about Islam, as well as those who had little or no influence on shaping public discourse about Islam. And so let me tell you the story that begins, my book actually begins with a history of Muslim American organizations in the United States and the broader struggle to shape public opinion about Islam before the 9/11 attacks. But today I'm going to focus mostly on the post-9/11 period because I think it has the most implications for the current type of mainstreaming of fringe ideas about Islam that we're seeing among conservative leaders. It's difficult to forget this image. It's seared into many of our heads, our subconscious. And yet what most of us may forget is that there was an outpouring of sympathy for Muslims after the 9/11 attacks. So the Pew Forum has conducted yearly surveys of American public opinion of Islam, which I'll soon show you, which show that there was, as I mentioned earlier, an increase in positive sentiment towards Muslims after the 9/11 attacks. This on top of dozens and dozens and dozens of statements from all manner of civil society groups arguing that Muslims are in fact a peaceful people who are being victimized by an apocryphal minority among them who are hijacking the religion for political ends. And this is an example of how the plagiarism detection analysis can show us this. So I need to take a few minutes to walk you through this graph. First of all, each of these circles describes an organization, a think tank, a religious group, an advocacy group, and so on. And the size of each circle describes how much media influence they had, how many times newspapers or television channels regurgitated their message in their press releases. And you can see some organizations, like the Council on American Islamic Relations that I mentioned earlier, have a lot of influence, but most organizations have no influence, these tiny little dots here. Now, the position of these circles in Cartesian space, or XY space, describes the similarity of their messages. So with a group of research assistants, I coded the type of language that each organization uses to describe Muslims. These could be things like a Muslims as victims narrative, or Islam as an inherently dangerous and violent religion narrative. And what we see is that most groups, as I just mentioned, were using a mainstream narrative that was simply that mainstream Muslim organizations or Muslim Americans are a peaceful group who are being victimized by a group of political radicals who have hijacked their religion for political ends. And yet, if we look at who got the most media attention, it's groups like the Middle East Forum or the Center for Security Policy, two relatively obscure organizations at the time, in the wake of 9/11, who are receiving a lion's share of media coverage. Now, these groups were advancing a so-called stealth jihad narrative, which will be another theme I'll talk about throughout the talk. And their narrative was essentially that Muslims, and Muslim Americans in particular, are a fifth column that's secretly plotting to undermine the U.S. Constitution, implement Sharia law, and they hide behind a thin veil of political correctness in so doing. So this is an example of the type of work that, the type of messages that came out. On the left is Daniel Pipes from the Middle East Forum, famously launched a Campus Watch campaign. His idea was that U.S. universities had been infiltrated by terrorist sympathizers or apologists for radical Islam, and that a concerted campaign was needed to out these folks and to prevent the future generation of U.S. leaders from being duped into the idea that Muslims are actually a peaceful group, when in fact he was arguing they are a kind of Trojan horse. Likewise, on the right here, you'll see Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy, one of the people who later became instrumental in the so-called anti-Sharia movement and the various attempts to create laws that would prevent the use of Sharia law in the United States. And he famously accused the White House of being infiltrated by extremists, among them Grover Norquist, who had very weak ties to a hedge fund that funds many of the largest Muslim American